The committee, and I now welcome representatives of the Institute of Public Affairs, understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, will you please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear today?
I'm Scott Hargraves, Executive Director of the Institute of Public Affairs.
Stephen Wilson, and I am a visiting fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs.
Terrific. Do either of you or both of you have an opening statement?
If you don't mind, I'll just say a very few brief words and then invite Stephen to continue. So the Institute of Public Affairs is a research organisation, a free market think tank as it's commonly called, and so we welcome the opportunity to talk about how we've arrived at a point where something that we would certainly endorse on principle, which is a free market in energy, we are now saying is in dire need of reform. It's reached the point where it's no longer a functioning free market. And I'd add a personal observation that I'm not unacquainted with the history of it myself, having started my career in the private sector working for the Victorian government when it was creating the national electricity market, and we could see its potential, but that model has now been broken, and we need to find our way out of it. And part of it is that just because we at the IPA support free markets in the abstract doesn't mean that we have to endorse the one we've got, that we would have to endorse markets in pseudo products like renewable energy or carbon credits or biodiversity credits or other things which are claimed to be exercises in free markets. And I particularly note an organisation that I once worked for as a contractor, which was NEMCO, morphed into AEMO, which has now taken on all sorts of central planning functions for which it seems to be very ill-suited, and we seem to have a textbook example of provider capture, which is an economic concept which seems very relevant here. And when you have provider capture, it's the consumers who lose. Stephen.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you, Chair, for the invitation and for allowing me to add a few comments. The committee will have received the submission that the IPA made, which unpacks our thinking that Scott has described in brief in a little more detail and specific to electricity. Like Scott, I started my career in Melbourne in the early 90s. We didn't know each other at that time. I was working in energy efficiency and demand-side management consulting before my long journey through energy and around the world back to here today. I think the key point of our submission is that the need for major reform of electricity markets is inevitable, as Scott's alluded to. I started drawing attention to this looming crisis publicly back in 2016, and it continues to deepen. I think we're starting to see a lot of people across the spectrum starting to recognise that that's the situation we're in. And I'd just say very briefly that I think we've navigated ourselves in Australia into a position where we're in the worst of both worlds, in the worst of the free market world and the worst of the central planning world. And it'll be challenging to navigate out of that, but that is one of the challenges that I think this place will need to play a role in.
Thank you. Senator Canavan.
Thank you, Chair. Can I start with your submission? I particularly was interested in the point you made towards the end of the submission about the incentives in the current system to build large-scale electricity generating plants, and I think you've got a quote here about baseload generating plants, and particularly how it interacts with our largely spot price market and the incentives to make these investments given that. Would you be able to expand a bit on that, on how you see the current market either not or not far enough incentivising baseload power investment?
Yeah. So I think just to set the context for that, Senator, the philosophy and the strong belief at the time the market was designed, and as building on Scott's point, we do need to remember that these markets are synthetically created through acts of parliament. They don't arise naturally like normal markets in, fruit and vegetables or other products that we might be familiar with. So the concept was that a market could be designed that would drive operational efficiency, so how the existing fleet of power plants are operated, would be encouraged to do so in the most efficient way on an hourly basis, or indeed on a 5-minute basis. And then the second part of the philosophy is that the price signal, that short-run 5-minute price signal that emerges from that operating market, would signal to investors what to invest in and where, so that we would naturally end up with the optimal combination of the right kind of plants.
Investors would see the price rising and realise there was a gap opportunity.
So, yeah, that's right. So the quote that's in here is a very old quote. It's from 1983 from Professor Josko and Professor Smolenski at MIT, and they were expressing scepticism that the kind of market design which we have in Australia would lead to those kind of investments, and that we would not see investment in large baseload plants of the type that we grew up with. And I think they've been vindicated in that. But in Australia, what we've seen, that the wave of investment in the last decade and a half or more, has all been in one type of generation, and that is intermittent generation that's trying to convert wind and solar into electricity, and that requires subsidies to incentivise investors to build those.
Right. Is the basic problem here that with those spot markets, it's hard to sort of write long-term contracts that underwrite the economics of a very large plant? I mean, the extreme end nuclear plant, very high capex, long-lived, even a coal plant, gas plant, similarly, that's high capex.
That is the essence of that quote, and I think it's fair to say we can observe that in today's market. The thing that's underwriting the investments that we do see in the wind and solar farms is guaranteed revenue from a contract that's ultimately traceable through to a separate legislated system which is designed to encourage that kind of generation, but it's not a free market.
Yeah, it's something that came from outside the national electricity market, and then the sort of investment, and Stephen will correct me if I don't characterise this exactly right, but the sort of investment that does arise spontaneously that we often see is in peaking gas, because that is simply operators who see that, well, there's a flood of intermittent energy coming in, so there will be occasions when there are big price spikes because the wind's not blowing, the sun's not shining, and so you have open cycle gas turbine facilities built which are pretty low efficiency in an energy sense, but have that market opportunity there. And so that's not necessarily a net addition to affordability and reliability. It's just taking that opportunity which has arisen only because of the influx of intermittent energy, and the combined cycle gas plants that we might have hoped for when the system was designed are pretty much unfinanceable, I think.
Yeah.
Just moving on, I note, I think Mr Wilson and definitely the IPA have published a report on what the cost would be of moving to renewable energy, a recent report this year, I believe. My quick read of this is that you conclude that those costs of moving to a renewable energy system could be up to 5 times more expensive than alternatives. The very similar evidence we heard from Net Zero Australia earlier this morning. Or a professor associated with Net Zero Australia, I should say. Can you take me through how you got to those numbers? What sort of modelling was behind this, and why is such a system so much more expensive than alternative options?
Yeah. So the paper you're referring to, I think, is called The Ruinous Cost of Free Energy, and what we describe is what the cost stack looks like for different kinds of energy systems. So we've moved from a system that the historical system had a foundation layer of coal-fired baseload generation, and we've characterised that as on the order of magnitude numbers around $50 megawatt hour wholesale cost type of system, 5 cents a kilowatt hour. We moved to a system where you've got gas setting the price a lot of the time, and you're at about double that kind of wholesale cost level. And then if we were to try and strip all the coal and all the gas out of the system and try and run the system just on intermittent renewables with the nuclear ban in place, we'd be looking at least double again. And that's just the wholesale energy component. And then on top of that, you've got to take into account that because you've got lower capacity factors, you need a lot more transmission, plus you're pulling energy from more remote sites. And so all these factors tend to compound. And then you find that the most important thing to understand about a physical electricity system, and this is a result of the laws of physics and engineering, is you've got to balance the generation and the load almost exactly, continuously, every second of the day. And if you fail to do that, you can black out, you can collapse the whole system. And so when you're trying to achieve that 99.998% reliability, and you don't have a nice balanced portfolio of assets that are available, say, 90% of the time, you're trying to achieve it with assets that are only available 20, 25, 30, 35% of the time. It becomes very, very difficult to do so, and you need to invest more and more and more capital solving that problem, and that's why you end up with very, very high costs.
So in rough terms, you're saying we used to have about $50 cost for wholesale energy. That's observable.
Before you're on the network, yep.
Yep, we saw that. That was roughly the average. Some states lower, but let's say about $50. Saying at the moment with our current gas prices in Australia, Eastern Coast gas prices, you're looking at $100 to produce from gas, and you're saying that the total system cost from renewables would be at least 200, maybe higher, depending on the transmission investments required.
Right, and I forgot to answer your question, which is what's that based on? So that's based on modelling work that I've supervised at PhD level in the university, and it's based on my reading of the literature from around the world.
So and I think, just to be clear, your estimates are not based on a levelised cost of electricity.
Certainly not.
And why is that? Why don't you think that measure is reliable?
Well, the levelised cost of energy is a very simple metric. I call it a sort of wet finger in the wind to give a rough feel of. It's answering a very simple question, and the question it's answering is, if I build this kind of power plant, whatever kind of power plant it is, and if I was to sell every kilowatt hour or every megawatt hour of energy from that plant at a constant price, in order to recover my fixed and variable costs, my capital and operating costs, what price would I need to sell it at with a given cost of capital and so forth? And it's the answer to that simple question. But it makes so many assumptions, one of which is that I will always be able to dispatch the amount of the energy that I want onto the system, and the system will be able to accept it, and the customer will pay that price. So that assumption breaks down when you get to very high shares of variable energy, because you hit saturation and the system can't accept it all. And we can already see this happening in the grid. We have myself and some colleagues at UQ have a paper in the published academic literature on this. So the symptoms of saturation are appearing, and what that means is that the implicit assumptions in LCOE break down and no longer hold. And so all it's telling you is what's the cost to put electrons onto the transmission system. It doesn't tell you anything about all the other costs of the system between the generator and the customer.
My understanding, though, is the Gen Cost report and the way it flows through to the ISP is largely based on the levelised cost of electricity. Is that correct?
There's an unreasonable over-reliance on LCOE and an unawareness or an unwillingness to take into account these issues we've just been talking about.
So in that report, we've said, it is possible to play around with assumptions in LCOE, but that is not actually the way to go either. What we need to be focused on is the total system cost. The paper is, apart from anything else, a plea to look at the system as a whole, that every time as Stephen says, every time an extra intermittent generator comes on, that has system-wide effects, and particularly as the level of saturation increases. So whatever institutional approach this committee recommends, whatever we come up with in Australia, it has to be one which is thinking about total system cost, and the principles of reliability and affordability and environmental impact explicitly set out, because just relying on LCOE and the sort of system planning approach we have at the moment is already disastrous, and potentially even more so.
I mean, in fairness to CSIRO, I've seen the last couple of Gen Cost reports have tried to calculate a figure for affirmed renewables cost. Have you looked at that at all? And is that close enough to this total system cost to help shed a light on these matters?
The basic problem with those exercises, Senator, is that if you're just looking at the technology in isolation, you're still not looking at the total system. So you have to look at the total system and see whole mix and the whole system in context. Once you come down to the generation level, you've broken the basic principle that you need to see the whole system.
And just finally, Chair, and or at least for this section, I was a bit perplexed last week why AEMO can't do this work. The ISP seems to be based on just take all of the government policies in place and run the system to get to those. It's effectively a goal-seek exercise.
Correct.
If you guys can do it with presumably relatively limited resources in the academic world, why can't we, or is there any reason why we can't instruct an AEMO to also calculate some kind of ISP, some kind of effect, price, outcomes of an unconstrained environment where we just run the system to achieve actually the lowest cost to consumers, not the lowest cost to implement the government's chosen pet policies? Yeah,
I think there's a high level question here, and Scott may want to give some comments on this, but I think the question is, is AEMO truly independent? Is its role independent of government or not? I had understood it was intended to be, but I think that is an open question now.
Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, and thanks to the witnesses for being here today. Can I just unpack one of the sentences in your submission that comes under the headline "Sound Economic Principles to Clarify a Practical Course of Action"? And it's really the first sentence there. The affordability. I won't read it aloud, but what does price volatility look like in a practical sense in the energy market? And why do you say that's of importance, if I've read that sentence correctly?
Yeah. When you look at the historical spot price data in the national electricity market, one of the most clear trends is a dramatic increase in price volatility. There are some presentations of mine, public talks I've given that show this graphically, and I'd be happy to table those afterwards for the committee's reference. But basically, in the early days, what you saw when you looked at, so that the way I've done this exercise to explain to people is to plot the 5-minute or the half-hourly price, so the price in each market settlement period in dollars per megawatt hour, and the megawatt demand at that moment in the market, and to plot that as a scatter plot. And what you see in the early years of the market, about the first decade or so, is that price curve is tracing out something like the short-run marginal cost of electricity generation. It's very gradually right, so at higher demand levels the price goes up, and then at the right-hand end you'll get a steep kick-up. But basically you've got a smooth curve, very tightly clustered, and very forecastable and very predictable by developers, by investors, and that bankers could look at and say, yep, we accept your price forecast and we'll provide the debt capital for your project. In the market today, with the extreme volatility and the difficulty of balancing generation and load, that pattern has been completely changed, and there's this very random pattern that is almost impossible to forecast. And indeed, in 2017, for a piece of work we did, we spoke to almost all the major banks in Australia, Australian, American, Asian, European, and asked them some questions. And one of the things that jumped out was that in almost every meeting, and before we even asked the question, they said, we just want to make a few things clear. And one of those is no one can produce a bankable price forecast of the national electricity market today, which goes to Senator Canavan's point about the difficulty of long-term investments in the absence of subsidies.
So that relates to the spot prices that are available to the producers of electricity that are then charged or effectively paid by the aggregator.
Yes.
Or what perhaps is your view on price volatility from a consumer perspective? So, for instance, we've had some discussion today about dynamic pricing or cost-reflective tariffs. Do you have a view of that, the role of those in an energy market?
I have a view on that. Scott might like to add to it. My view is that it's clear in the market design right from the beginning. Remember, the wholesale market was opened up first and then later the retail market. And the standard approach is that the consumers, including the smallest consumers, your household and mine, gets an annual price contract with the retailer. So the retailer is providing essentially like a form of risk insurance against the volatility in the wholesale market, and I'm not exposed to that, and neither are you. Now, there are suggestions that we expose or increase the degree of exposure of small customers to these highly volatile price movements. Small customers do not have the financial capacity to expose themselves to that degree of risk. So this is a very serious topic. And the cost, there is, but they have to pay a cost, because the cost of managing that volatility, there's a physical, technical, engineering cost to it, and there's a financial cost for holding that price volatility, and that has to be charged through to the consumer as a risk premium, in effect. That's one of many reasons that our bills are going up.
Yeah, another way of looking at it, if I may, Senator, thank you, is there is also in the academic literature, which both Stephen and I have seen, evidence that with volatility goes increasing costs. If you plot different energy systems around the world, the higher the volatility, the higher the cost. So the only question then is, are you going to put that cost on the aggregator and it appears in a flatter tariff, or are you going to try to pass it on to the consumer? But one way or another, somebody is paying for that extra volatility, and as Stephen said, I think we would take the view that there are severe limits to the extent to which the average consumer really can manage those, or even the average industrial consumer. You're just pushing the costs out to somewhere, and it's got to be managed through other means.
In terms of the price volatility, I'm probably more familiar with the Western Australian example than the national market, but certainly there's a significant and growing number of retail consumers, like households, that feed power back into the grid, mainly through solar, but not exclusively. To what extent does that contribute to the volatility you were talking about in terms of prices in the spot market?
Yeah, it's definitely contributing to it. We have to remember that the design of the Western Australian market is different in certain important respects from the design of the market on the East Coast. It's more like, as I understand it, a European balancing market. But the underlying fundamental issue is, it's still electricity. You've still got the balancing challenge that I mentioned earlier. And so, yes, so the rooftop solar generation can't be seen clearly by the control room. They have to estimate what that is, and they can't directly control it. And so when it's at very small scale, it doesn't matter much, but when it's at large scale, it really starts to matter, and it can flick the market around in an extremely volatile way. It's also correlated, obviously, with large solar farms.
And we do have a paper specific to the WA energy market reviewing the statement provided by then Premier Mark McGowan in 2022. So that report's available. It's called Unachievable at Any Cost, about the plan to unwind baseload power in WA. I think by 2030 was the original target. So we also have our concerns on that front.
One of the concerns that's raised in your submission relates to the subsidies or incentives provided to renewable energy options in the current market. Mm-hmm. Now, as you'll be aware, the national energy objectives, as set out in the National Energy Law and in any number of other of the objective statements of the organisations involved in this space, the National Gas Objective, the National Energy Retail Objective, contain an objective that relates to Australia reducing its greenhouse gas emissions and overall or potentially helping those. Are you broadly supportive of that objective?
The commentary that I've given on that, and this has been on the record since I think it was 2017, I first wrote a paper that was published by the Energy Policy Institute of Australia back then, is that at that time that objective, to be clear, was not in the National Electricity Law. It was introduced more recently. But my commentary at that time was that goal, which was which was only sitting in the renewable energy, the act that sits underneath the renewable energy target, is in direct conflict with the original objectives of the national electricity market. And that when we reached a certain scale, the conflict would become apparent. It's just like having two trains on the same track heading towards each other. Everyone's happy and smiling until they actually collide. And that, I can't predict exactly when that disastrous collision happens, but inevitably it will come. So, yeah, there's and the conflict's now, as you've observed, been introduced directly into the law. That's a serious problem. Everything's flowing from that.
I mean, to go back to sort of almost starting premises, do you agree with the imperative that sits behind that objective, which is that it's necessary to reduce Australia's emissions as part of an effort to reduce overall fossil fuel emissions to prevent climate change?
Yeah, I'll make a few comments and then Scott might like to add to it. I think we need to ask ourselves some difficult questions, which is what can we as a country actually achieve? What will we actually achieve if we were even able to achieve that objective? Now, I think our chance of achieving that objective in practical terms is extremely low, and I think we do need to look at this practically as well as philosophically, because the question is, do we destroy our economy and damage our society in the achievement of that objective? I think the key fundamental principle here that I think would be good if we can all acknowledge is that all of these things involve trade-offs, technical trade-offs and economic trade-offs, and that's what's inherent in the energy policy trilemma, and the conflicting goals are now in the law, and we're having real trouble resolving them.
Yeah, in a discussion about what are the institutional arrangements, if there is, if society at large, for whatever reason, has this imperative of targeting greenhouse gas emissions, the system that we have to achieve that is not being facilitated through the energy market. It's actually destroying the energy market, and it would have to be done some other way. And one of the other points about that long-term policy setting, so if you had a net zero by 2050 policy setting, doesn't make any sense to me, but if that is the official policy setting, we have to get out of this mindset where we're constantly in a rush to meet a near-term goal, a 2025 goal, a 2030 goal, a 2035 goal, because we're actually making things worse right now and foreclosing other opportunities that we have.
So I think I've understood the practical element that you're raising, but do I take it also from that answer, and I think I've got an inference, but I just want to confirm it, that philosophically you wouldn't agree with this imperative?
I think probably for the IPA, I was in chapter 20 of Climate Change: The Facts 2020, where I think I came out as a very mild lukewarmist. That I wouldn't deny that there's a possibility of human-induced climate change, a contribution, but I'm happy to also have on our stage someone like Professor Ian Plimer, who's a professor of geology, very well respected, who says, well, it's anthropogenic carbon dioxide's 3% of the total carbon cycle, so what possible effect could it be having, as well as other criticisms. So for the public policy discussion, it just doesn't seem very relevant to the question that we have in front of us, is are we going to destroy the energy system that we have in pursuit of a goal that is questionable as a goal, and certainly Australia's contribution towards meeting that goal is very minor at best.
Yeah, I'll just share my personal journey, which was that as a young person I was a full believer in the early 1990s, and then I've travelled an arc and become more questioning about the claims being made on climate. But I would strongly recommend the book by Judith Curry, which is on risk and uncertainty. She herself went on a journey, and I've written a review of that book, which the IPA published. So, I think the thing we've got to be able to do is we've got to be able to have grown-up conversations.
This will be my last question. You referred to it as a trilemma. There are often times in In policy spaces, I don't need to tell either of you this, that where you're managing competing objectives and you're trying to reconcile optimal outcomes while achieving multiple objectives that have tensions between them.
Correct.
If you were to design a system that achieves emissions reduction targets as an imperative while also trying to preserve some of the overall goals of this system, including minimising price and ensuring reliability, what are the ways you'd approach that?
Well, the first thing I'd do is remove the nuclear ban. I mean, that's how the Americans resolved this. You know, they were at each other's throats for a long time on this issue, and they've figured out, well, you know, there's the reconciliation. So you don't ban technologies. That's the first thing, because what we've done is we've overly constrained ourselves to the point there is no solution. So we need to relax constraints that can be relaxed. And all take a deep breath, stop the panic and the rush and the artificial deadlines. Think about the physical reality of electricity and how it actually works. That's non-negotiable. The electrons are pretty dumb. They've never heard of any of these political parties or colours. And so we recognise that. And then I think through that kind of process, we come to a sensible balance and compromise.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Just to complete the trifecta, and thank you both for not dating me earlier, but I too started in the Victorian energy markets. It wasn't the electricity market. I was working on the disaggregation and privatisation of the gas and fuel, but very similar sort of processes, and obviously worked in many other parts of it since. Looking at what we've got at the moment, there's an electricity market. It is trying to get away from coal, whether that's because coal's going to retire or no one's going to invest in it or it's banned, is immaterial for the argument. How is it best optimised when you have so much price volatility, as you were saying before, due to the energy mix or any other factors? Could be storms and weather taking out lines, etc. With that, how do we resolve for getting a smoother form of energy into the market, and therefore smoother prices?
Well, you need to have a certain amount of base load power. You need to have power generation sources that have high availability factors and that are dispatchable and that have the requisite degree of flexibility. But at the underpinning layer is you do need to have base load generation. It's like the foundation of the house. And that's what we're pulling down. And so if we keep pulling that down, we'll see the volatility keeping on increasing, the prices, the costs and the prices rising, and the reliability falling. So we do need to recognise that. And, I've mentioned nuclear before. The reason that needs to be on the table is that it actually can tick all the boxes that everyone wants ticked. So the governance and the system and the rules need to be able to accommodate physical assets that can perform the job that we need them to perform.
Yes.
If I may just add, Stephen in his paper also just reminds us that baseload is fundamentally a demand-side concept. We do hear from around the traps this idea that baseload is itself an antiquated concept. I think that's a persuasive technique. It doesn't stand up to scrutiny. The need for baseload energy is as real as it ever was, and when we are talking about bringing in other forms of baseload, if coal has to be retired, I don't think it needs to be, but let's say coal has to be retired, nuclear is a baseload alternative. Pairing an intermittent generator with a battery does not produce a firm generator. This idea that intermittent energy can be firmed, I think, is another rhetorical trick, because when that battery has depleted, we're back to intermittent energy. So we would also need gas-fired generation as backup, and then there are capacity constraints. Baseload is baseload, and there's really only, in Australia, a coal or nuclear, or perhaps in WA with abundant gas, the possibility of baseload gas, if you can find a gas turbine in a very competitive market that we have at the moment.
Interesting position. I take no position on any of those forms of generation. I guess where my questions come from is, given that we are likely to retire most, if not all, of the coal fleet, that even with the best intentions and fastest market movement, we're not going to see nuclear for 10, 15 years. How do we, other than storage, how else do we solve for that volatility and security of supply?
I don't think it's safe to assume that we're likely to retire the coal plant under the current conditions. I think that's a misleading message. What we're presented with is an accelerated schedule of coal plant retirement that's part of a certain narrative. If you look at the intended plan design 50-ish year life of those assets, you'll see a more gradual retirement schedule. If we don't invest, if no one in Australia invests in assets that are able to do the full job that those assets currently do, the full set of services they provide to the system, we will not be able to retire those assets. So there's a strategic game being played by the owners of these assets, I believe. We've already seen the beginning of this. Well, in Victoria it's a little bit less transparent, but in New South Wales it's been more transparent, where the state premier has instructed the owner of the Eraring power station that, sorry, it cannot close when you've indicated. It must be extended for at least 2 years and possibly another 2 after that. I think if we don't get ourselves organised with an alternate source of generation, we will just see more and more and more of this incremental extension. It's not very optimal, because the owners of the assets can't really do long-term planning of, basic operations and maintenance, and so, the machines are not being perhaps maintained the way they would be if there was more clarity and certainty and confidence available.
Given the fact that that doesn't seem to be being planned for, other than, as you say, and I'll come back to Eraring shortly, certainly our integrated system plan doesn't seem to be taking into account that, other than pushing for more renewable energy, variable energy, connected by transmission. Given when you did SEC and I did gas and fuel, all that transmission was disaggregated and privatised, and then those blocks of transmission and distribution in both markets, they were operated as a regulated monopoly. Now, 20-odd years, whatever it is, 30-odd years down the track, we've still got these monopolies sitting within the system, yet the ISP especially talks about introducing even more transmission, but there's no contestability about that. Does transmission in any way help, in a meaningful, material way, help firm up or balance that supply?
Correct. So when, again, going back to those halcyon days, senators, we had state-based grids, and there were efficiency gains that arose from building interconnectors between those grids, and this was seen as a good thing, and probably was a good thing, and it gave extra reliability and probably lowered prices. I also worked on the Basslink cable, which the terrestrial portion of which I think is still the last transmission line to actually be added to the grid in Victoria. So a couple of things arise from that, one of which is that it's all very well to draw maps with all these extra transmission lines, but it's devilish to go through the process, and we're realising how expensive they are, and it's being driven by regulated companies. It's not contestable. There is a regulated rate of return, but what they want is to expand their asset base, because that is the only way they can increase their profits. And I would also say that we're now no longer talking particularly about interconnectors that add to the overall efficiency of the system. We're talking about just building transmission lines to justify connection to intermittent energy projects, whether it's to connect to Snowy 2.0, and that's a whole other story about how expensive that is, or in Western Victoria, essentially having saturated the existing 500 kV line, where consumers are essentially being asked to underwrite extra transmission lines, essentially so that more wind farms and in other places solar factories can be installed, and this is not solving a reliability problem, it's actually making it worse. And I think Claire Savage actually complained that the utilisation of the national electricity grid was actually going down, but this is why, because it's more and more reliant on intermittent energy. So I hope that addresses your question.
Yeah, it does to an extent. So the transmission, say, to Western Victoria, I can make some argument for that getting generation that's being built into the market. But interconnectors, can you see a current day economic justification for large-scale interstate interconnectors?
Over and above the ones we have, Stephen, this is where I will throw to you.
So I mean, with these kind of investments, there's always diminishing returns, and so the regulatory system was designed to put economic tests in place, the RIT-T test for transmission, regulated investment test for transmission, to test whether the incremental capital investment, was justified on economic grounds. And as a general observation, most, perhaps all of these proposed transmission investments are struggling or failing to pass that economic test. And we must remember that these tests, and there's an equivalent one in the distribution level as well, were put in place to protect the interests of the consumer. So as Scott rightly said, the natural incentive of the transmission and distribution asset owners is to build a bigger network, because once the investments are approved, they go into the regulated asset base and they earn their return for decades. So it's a very serious thing that those tests are applied properly, but what we seem to be seeing is regulatory agencies, and with the encouragement of ministers of the Crown, encouraging the bypassing of these economic tests.
Thank you for that. So to me, when you look at the NEM and the interconnectors, I would have said for trying to establish an economic case, you need some form of differential, i.e. you're getting access to cheaper electricity in one region or one market and importing into another. Now that might have been the case, or might still be the case with Victorian brown coal being sold into the market. That might be the case. But there is no very real capacity factor, as in resource factor, across Australia, or certainly on the NEM. You get a little bit more sunshine in Queensland than you do in Victoria, but not significant. There's no advantage to geographic spread, because it runs north-south, not east-west. So you've got, if it went east-west, you'd at least derive a temporal change or differential. But yeah, there's no real economic case to be made for this. And I would argue that the RIT-T is not an economic test. It may very well, as it's called, be an investment test and look at the lowest cost to perform to get a certain piece of kit. But there's not much economic argument for it, is there?
Well, I think that's what you see when you run the numbers. There's a limit to how much extra benefit you can get from extra capacity. And just on your point on diversity, we have looked at some research I was involved in, looked at how much benefit is there from wind diversity around this continent, and the surprising answer was a little bit, but not very much. Yeah,
I've seen those numbers myself. And so you mentioned state ministers getting involved. Is it fair, interconnectors do play a role in system security in a region if there is a drop in supply or an increase in load or something like that. But that would be fairly rare occurrence, wouldn't it? That a system or part of a system would become so strained that it's at risk of blackout or load shedding.
Well, as a general principle, a more interconnected system gives you, you're sharing the benefits of available capacity more widely. The flip side is the larger an interconnected AC synchronous system becomes, the more sort of vulnerable it is. But you usually design it in a way that a disturbance in one area might black out that local area, but you don't want it to take the whole system down. So to get the really detailed answers, of course, you have to do the detailed engineering studies, but the general principles, I think, are clear and generally agreed upon.
And just very briefly, my observation, my characterisation is that the risk is that we've moved from the very sensible way you've described how we should be thinking about interconnectors to one where interconnectors are trying to solve other problems like intermittency or indeed unwillingness to keep supplying base load. I worry about New South Wales essentially seeing Queensland as the solution to energy shortfalls, to systemic energy shortfalls. That's not a solution that Queenslanders will put up with forever. We've seen what happens when Victoria relied too heavily on Basslink and the cable actually failed, which created problems on both sides. So I think the way you described it was how it should be, but increasingly in this top-down energy planning model that we have, we're using interconnectors and new transmission lines to try and solve other problems in an inappropriate way.
Thank you. In the market event of June 2022 would say interconnectors didn't help stop that problem, in fact probably exacerbated it. Would that be fair?
I've not looked at the role of interconnectors in that event, but that was a serious event that is one of the symptoms of the problems that we've been talking about today.
Just quickly, and I need to wrap up, you mentioned state ministers, and not just state ministers, but governments. When the NEM was set up, it was meant to be independent of government. We're seeing more government intervention into this, particularly by state ministers. Do you think, are there arguments for revisiting how the NEM is operated and perhaps divulging it back to, divesting it back to states for them to plan and run?
That's a big question. Scott might want to pick up on this in a second, but my general perception is that the states largely, not entirely, obviously Queensland and Tasmania didn't go down the full privatisation road with the southern states, but the state governments, divested assets. It'd be, and looking at their financial positions today would be a big ask for them to renationalise the assets. Of course, the Constitution is silent on electricity because of the history. And so there is a certain responsibility that sort of inherently resides with the states, but the states seem to be unwilling to take on great big difficult problems, and it looks to me like the problems are sort of falling into the lap of the Commonwealth, but the Commonwealth is a little bit constrained in what it can do. So it seems that there's a need for leadership from the federal parliament and cooperation with the states to sort out the mess we're in.
Yeah, I suspect we can't go back. I don't. Many of the Howard government's decisions in major infrastructure areas were to centralise power. That happened. We now have to live with that, and I don't think, just a personal observation, I don't think it's coincidental that, say, 100 years since Sir John Monash was invited by the Victorian government to lead a public utility and actually just go and build some power stations, that now we have the Commonwealth government, which never had any involvement in such matters. We have the opposition putting it on the table. Well, perhaps the federal government will start letting contracts for somebody to build a nuclear power station, and they'll take care of the underwriting. I'm not talking about the merits of that, but that shows how the locus of this issue has shifted from the states to the Commonwealth, and I suspect, I wish the states would lift their game in other areas and allow more gas exploration, but I think we're now in an era where the Commonwealth, for better or for worse, is going to have to take the lead.
thank you, and to both of your points, that's why this inquiry was stood up, to look at those things. So thank you for appearing. Or did you have a follow-up quickly?
We break? What, I'm just clarifying.
We've just got a break.
Are we over
A
time?
very quick break. Okay. Yes, we are.
Well, I'm happy
My
to stick
fault.
to the schedule. It's fine.
Okay.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
gentlemen.
Thank you, Senator.
We'll just break for a 10-minute